Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Regrets? Not a bit of it. Instead, the usual defiance from North Korea, which has responded to new, tougher international sanctions by pledging to boost its nuclear arsenal and threatening the United States with a thousand-fold revenge. And there were strong words, too, from North Korea's foreign minister, who's in Manila for a security summit of regional leaders. His country, he warned, was ready to teach the US a severe lesson. From there, our Asia correspondent, Jonathan Miller, reports.
Ri Yong-ho, North Korea's foreign minister, had purpose in his stride as he set out this morning.
Mr. Ri, will you talk to the Americans?
He didn't in the end, but it had just emerged that he had spoken to the South Korean foreign minister, albeit briefly. Over the weekend, the UN Security Council had unanimously slapped harsh new sanctions on Pyongyang after 2 ICBM tests last month. Today, as Mr. Ri was out talking, North Korean television denounced the US-led sanctions. It threatened to retaliate 1,000 times over. 9 hours after he'd left, Mr. Ri, Pyongyang's former ambassador to London, called it a night.
Minister, is this crisis negotiable? Minister?
He just delivered a speech to an Asian security forum.
Is your government prepared to negotiate, sir?
We affirm that we'll never place our nuclear and ballistic missile programs on the negotiating table and won't flinch an inch on strengthening our nuclear armament.
Mr. Bang then launched a sheaf of manila envelopes at reporters containing the minister's statement. There weren't enough to go round, and a furious scramble ensued.
Can I take a photograph of yours?
There was a hunger to know exactly where North Korea stood after months of inflammatory rhetoric. Now, they had formally set out their stall.
Well, the chaos has subsided slightly as journalists here scramble to decipher the headlines from this long document handed out. It's in both English and Korean. And the thrust of it seems to be that the North Korean regime believes that its own nuclear development is entirely legitimate and is a response to the nuclear threat posed to it by the United States.
Official American war pictures show one of the first heavy strikes by B-29s against North Korean communications and establishments, a surprise attack.
The speech described what Pyongyang views as 7 decades of US aggression. But because of US domination of what it called the propaganda media, the world was not aware of the truth. Where there's oppression, there is resistance, it said. Where there's a nuclear threat, there is bound to be nuclear deterrence. The statement listed 8 countries North Korea claimed the US had attacked, noting that none was a nuclear state. In Manila today, the US Secretary of State stood with his allies, the foreign ministers of South Korea and Japan.
Well, the best signal that North Korea could give us that they're prepared to talk would be to stop these missile launches. We've not had an extended period of time where they have not taken some type of provocative action by launching ballistic missiles.
South Korea's President Moon Jae-in spoke to Donald Trump on the phone today. They agreed that North Korea and its missiles posed a grave and growing threat. The crippling new sanctions on North Korea were described by the US as the most stringent placed on any country in a generation. But Kim Jong-un remains defiant, vowing to teach the United States a lesson. Today in Manila, his paranoid regime spelled out point by point a detailed rationale for its behavior. It may be flawed, but it's not devoid of reason, giving some hope that in this crisis, reason may yet prevail. Jonathan Miller, Channel 4 News, Manila.
Well, joining me now from Washington is Bruce Klingner. He was chief of the CIA's Korea branch during the Clinton administration, trying to curb Pyongyang's growing nuclear ambitions. He's now a senior research fellow at the Heritage Foundation's Asian Studies Center. Thanks for joining us. If you were sitting in Pyongyang looking at nuclear-armed Donald Trump, you'd want nuclear weapons too, wouldn't you?
Well, we've seen that North Korea has blamed the U.S. hostile policy, but that didn't prevent them from agreeing to 4 international agreements promising never to build nuclear weapons, all of which failed, and then subsequently signing 4 subsequent agreements promising to give up the weapons they promised never to build in the first place. All of those negotiations also failed.
Well, what effect do you think the sanctions, the new sanctions, will have? I mean, they aim to bite into a huge amount of North Korean exports.
Right. They're sort of yet another good but incremental step in increasing international pressure on North Korea for its repeated defiance of the UN Security Council resolutions. So one would have hoped we could have been here with the first resolution, but it does take time because China continues to block more meaningful actions. But with this resolution, as with all the previous ones, really the effect will be determined by how effectively that they are implemented and enforced. And recently, the UN panel of experts, yes, by China and actually other countries as well, though China is the biggest stumbling block. The UN panel of experts report again affirmed recently that these sanctions have been implemented really, sporadically by many nations, including China. So
it doesn't sound like you think that these sanctions will bring North Korea to the negotiating table. I mean, what is the next step that the CIA would be wargaming? I mean, did you used to wargame military action?
Yes, we did. And any kind of military action, the alliance always won, but it was at the cost of hundreds of thousands of casualties. That's why I've recommended against preventative attack, as some in Washington and Seoul have been advocating. I think there's much more can be done on the pressure side, and we should exhaust those possibilities before we pull the trigger on a military option.
So what is possible?
Well, for one thing, the U.S. has continued to pull its punches on enforcing our own laws, despite widespread misperceptions, such as when President Obama declared that North Korea was the most heavily sanctioned, the most cut-off nation on earth. Actually, that's not correct. It was only last year that the U.S. had cumulatively sanctioned as many North Korean entities as we had sanctioned those of Zimbabwe. So there's still more we can do. We've really been giving de facto immunity from U.S. law to Chinese entities that are misusing the U.S. financial system for money laundering and other crimes. So 3 weeks or so ago, the Trump administration sanctioned the Bank of Dandong, a small Chinese bank. That was the first action the U.S. government had taken against a Chinese bank in 12 years. So, we've sanctioned we've imposed $12 billion.
Just because we're short of time, I mean, I just wonder, do you think with a different attitude in Washington, you could have got to some sort of deal like the Iranian one with North Korea, or was that never a possibility?
Well, if North Korea had come to the negotiating table in a meaningful way, but what we've seen is over the years, these negotiations have failed. North Korea repeatedly has cheated on them and now declares it has no interest in returning to negotiations to denuclearize.
Bruce Klingner, thank you very much indeed for joining us.
Now to another part of the world, and he may be unpredictable, but it was a fair bet that North Korea's leader, Kim Jong-un, was going to be pretty angry about international sanctions being taken against his country. They will cost his nation more than $1 billion just when he wants money for his nuclear missile tests, amongst other things. So no surprise, perhaps, that the message that went out loud and clear on state TV was that North Korea would retaliate, as he put it, 1,000-fold.
If the United States thinks it's safe across an ocean, there is no bigger misunderstanding, declared this determined North Korean newsreader. Delivering a statement from Kim Jong-un's regime, she said sanctions would be met with thousands-fold revenge. The broadcast on state television came as the leaders of Southeast Asia met in the Philippines. All of the nations in North Korea's firing line uniting behind the latest United Nations resolution to impose the toughest sanctions yet. Having rejected talks with South Korea, the North Korean delegation reiterated the country's commitment to nuclear weapons.
Unless the United States' villainous politics and nuclear threats are solved and settled, our nuclear arms and intercontinental ballistic missile will never be up for negotiation.
Twice last month, Kim Jong-un successfully tested long-range missiles. Missiles he hopes will one day be armed with a nuclear warhead and pointed towards the United States. President Trump claims China could easily prevent such an escalation.
There's growing resentment here in Beijing towards the American attitude that China holds the key to resolving tensions on the Korean peninsula. The Chinese government again insisting today that such a complex and sensitive issue can only be diffused through negotiation between all of the countries involved.
It may be talk China is advocating, but it has begun conducting naval drills. Even North Korea's so-called ally is preparing for the worst. Debbie Edward, News at 10, Beijing.
America's outward show of anger at North Korea's latest missile test was limited, if that's the right word, to a launch of its own last week. So why has there been nothing more menacing from the US? Well, American estimates for how much of North Korea's meagre economy it spends on its military are quite frankly staggering. Over the past decade, Pyongyang spent 25% of its GDP on defense. To give you a sense of scale and maybe perspective, we spend just over 2% back here. Those levels of spending allow Kim Jong-un to have an army that's more than 1 million strong, as well as 1,000 missiles of varying ranges. The country's strategic position also makes it a threat. The capital, Pyongyang, is only 120 miles from the South Korean capital, Seoul, and 800 miles from Tokyo, well within striking range of its latest tested missiles. Well, let's go to Washington now, and our correspondent Juliet Bremner, who is there. Juliet, looking at all this, doesn't look like there are many good options for the US. So what is it likely to do now, do you think?
What it won't be doing is rushing into any kind of war. There simply isn't any good, effective or realistic military option. Everyone seems to be agreed on that. If you think about it, if Washington tried to take out missiles that are in North Korea at the moment, it would just lead to a bloodbath in South Korea. You've got 26 million people living in and around Seoul, and they're in the direct firing line. So despite the hardline rhetoric that you've been hearing from some Trump supporters, I think you should listen instead to what Rex Tillerson, the Secretary of State, is saying. He's being far more pragmatic. What he says to the North Koreans is, just to get to the talks table, you simply have to stop your missile testing program. It's a much lower bar than was set by the Obama administration, who said they had to actually start their nuclear disarmament. And I think what he'd like to see is sanctions hand in hand with diplomacy, ultimately leading to multinational talks.
OK, Juliet, thank you very much indeed.
I've been